The moment a badge forgets the Constitution, justice begins counting the seconds. On a gray Tuesday morning in Norfolk, Virginia, the sidewalks outside the federal courthouse were already crowded with attorneys balancing coffee cups, reporters chasing routine hearings, and families hoping for ordinary outcomes inside an extraordinary building. No one paid much attention when two black men stepped out of a dark blue pickup truck parked legally along the curb. They looked like the kind of men who carried themselves with quiet purpose rather than loud confidence. Isaiah Brooks, 34, broad-shouldered with short natural curls beneath a charcoal baseball cap, adjusted the strap of a weathered duffel bag before glancing toward the courthouse entrance. Beside him, Daniel Carter, 36, taller by a few inches with a close-cropped haircut and an expression that rarely revealed emotion, checked the time on a rugged military watch. Their clothing was simple, hoodies, jeans, and well-worn boots, but every movement reflected years of discipline. They walked neither too fast nor too slow, speaking little because neither believed every silence needed to be filled. They were scheduled to appear in court as witnesses connected to a federal legal matter, one that required them to arrive quietly and avoid unnecessary attention. The details of why they were there were protected by orders neither man intended to discuss outside the courtroom. "You ever notice," Daniel said with a faint smile, "people think confidence has to be loud?" Isaiah looked ahead at the courthouse doors. Real confidence usually doesn't. Less than 20 feet away, Officer Ethan Mercer watched them from beside his patrol vehicle. Tall, athletic, clean-shaven, and wearing mirrored sunglasses despite the overcast sky, Mercer had spent nearly 15 years convincing himself that instinct mattered more than evidence. He noticed their muscular builds, their calm expressions, the military-style boots, and the fact that they spoke in low voices instead of looking around nervously. Somehow, to him, composure itself became suspicious. Mercer had watched two white attorneys carrying similar duffel bags enter the courthouse only minutes earlier without questioning them. Yet when Isaiah and Daniel approached in casual clothing, he immediately decided their presence required investigation. He stepped forward with the certainty of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Gentlemen," he called out, his tone firm enough to turn nearby heads, "I need to ask you a few questions." Isaiah stopped first, his hands remaining visible at his sides. Daniel followed without hesitation. "Morning, officer," Isaiah answered evenly. "Is there a problem?" Mercer ignored the question. "IDs." Both men calmly produced identification without argument. Mercer glanced at them only briefly before his attention shifted toward the pickup truck. Another officer had radioed moments earlier about a vehicle matching a similar color involved in an incident several miles away, though the description remained incomplete. Instead of verifying the license plate through dispatch before escalating, Mercer let assumptions fill the gaps that facts had not yet reached. Around them, pedestrians slowed. A law student paused on the courthouse steps. Someone across the street quietly lifted a phone, sensing drama before understanding context. Daniel remained perfectly still. Years of military training had taught him that emotional reactions often made difficult situations worse. Isaiah noticed the growing audience, but kept his voice respectful. "Officer, if there's a misunderstanding, we're happy to cooperate." Mercer barely looked at him. "Save it." The words landed harder than they sounded, not because they were shouted, but because they dismissed cooperation before it had a chance to exist. The atmosphere shifted. Conversations faded. Even the courthouse security officers glanced toward the sidewalk. Mercer spoke into his radio, requested additional units, then looked back at the two men with growing certainty that he had already solved the situation. Neither Isaiah nor Daniel resisted when instructed to remain where they were. Neither argued. Neither attempted to leave. Their calmness only seemed to reinforce Mercer's confidence that he was reading the situation correctly. What no one standing on that sidewalk, not the reporters, not the spectators, not even Officer Mercer, could possibly know was that both men had spent years serving missions where remaining composed under pressure had saved lives. Both men were decorated operators assigned to a naval special warfare unit. Isaiah had served as a Navy SEAL for more than 12 years, while Daniel, now a senior chief, had led teams through some of the Navy's most sensitive overseas missions. And hidden inside Isaiah's duffel bag was a sealed folder that, if opened by the wrong person at the wrong moment, would transform an ordinary courthouse hearing into a story the entire country would soon be talking about. Officer Ethan Mercer accepted the identification cards without revealing what had already settled in his mind. He glanced at the names, looked briefly at their photographs, then lowered the cards as though they confirmed a conclusion he had reached long before reading them. Around him, 2 additional patrol officers arrived, responding to his radio request with the quiet efficiency expected on a weekday morning outside a federal courthouse. Curious pedestrians slowed their pace. A local television photographer, originally assigned to cover an unrelated hearing, instinctively turned a camera toward the growing scene. Isaiah Brooks remained exactly where he stood, his posture relaxed but disciplined, while Daniel Carter folded his hands loosely in front of him and watched every movement without appearing confrontational. Their restraint confused several people in the crowd. Most expected arguments, raised voices, or hurried explanations. Instead, they saw 2 men whose calm seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Mercer interpreted that composure differently. To him, it suggested rehearsed confidence rather than innocence. He stepped toward the pickup truck and asked dispatch to verify the registration. Before the response could arrive, he noticed the weathered duffel bag resting near Isaiah's feet. "What is inside the bag?" he asked. Isaiah answered without hesitation. "Personal property and sealed federal documents that are scheduled to be presented through the proper legal process." The words immediately caught the attention of one of the younger officers standing nearby. Federal documents. It sounded unusual, yet Isaiah's tone carried none of the uncertainty of someone inventing an excuse. Mercer narrowed his eyes. "Open it." Isaiah remained respectful. "Officer, I cannot voluntarily break the chain of custody without authorization from the requesting agency. I can provide the contact information listed in the paperwork." A few spectators exchanged puzzled looks. The answer sounded formal, almost practiced. Daniel quietly added, "We intend to cooperate within the limits of our legal obligations." Mercer heard only refusal. In his experience, cooperation meant immediate compliance, and anything else felt like defiance. The younger officer leaned closer and spoke softly enough that only Mercer could hear. "Dispatch has not confirmed the vehicle match yet. We may want to wait another minute." Mercer dismissed the suggestion with a slight shake of his head. "We already have enough." Across the sidewalk, a courthouse security supervisor watched carefully but chose not to interfere. The encounter remained peaceful, and every participant still appeared composed. Even so, an uneasy feeling settled over several witnesses. Something about the exchange felt incomplete, as though an important piece of information had not yet reached the people making decisions. Then the first microsecond of doubt appeared. Dispatch transmitted another update through Mercer's radio, but static swallowed part of the message. The only clearly audible words were, "Stand by, additional verification." Mercer released the radio button before the sentence finished, convinced it would change nothing. Isaiah noticed the interruption, yet said nothing. Daniel glanced briefly toward the courthouse entrance, checking the time again. Their hearing was only minutes away. Missing it could complicate far more than their own schedule. Mercer stepped forward and formally announced that both men were under arrest pending investigation into the reported vehicle and the sealed materials. The younger officer immediately looked toward him, surprised that Mercer was escalating before dispatch. Had completed verification. Isaiah and Daniel exchanged one brief glance, then calmly turned as instructed and allowed the officers to secure their wrists. Neither resisted, raised his voice, or attempted to invoke military status. Within moments, both Navy SEALs stood handcuffed beside separate patrol vehicles, while courthouse witnesses recorded the arrest from the sidewalk. Several spectators whispered in disbelief, unable to understand why 2 men who had cooperated from the beginning were now being arrested. Across the entrance plaza, the older courthouse employee quietly recognized the Naval Special Warfare insignia stitched onto Daniel's duffel strap. His expression changed instantly. He stepped aside, reached for his phone, and dialed a number from memory. When the call connected, he spoke only one urgent sentence. "I think you need to know who is standing outside the courthouse right now." The atmosphere outside the courthouse changed without anyone announcing it. Conversations softened into whispers as Isaiah Brooks and Daniel Carter were escorted toward the waiting patrol vehicles, not because they resisted, but because they did not. Their measured pace, steady breathing, and quiet composure stood in sharp contrast to the growing assumptions surrounding them. Officer Ethan Mercer interpreted every calm response as calculated confidence, convinced he had prevented something serious before it could unfold. The younger officer walking beside him remained noticeably quieter than before, replaying the interrupted dispatch message in his mind. It bothered him that verification had never actually been completed. Still, Mercer had already taken command of the situation, and no one openly challenged his decision. A woman standing near the courthouse steps lowered her phone after recording several minutes of the encounter. She quietly remarked to another bystander, "They have not argued once." The man beside her nodded. "That is what surprises me." Isaiah glanced toward Daniel for only a second. They had served together long enough to communicate without unnecessary words. They both understood that their priority was protecting the legal process connected to the sealed documents, not winning an argument on a public sidewalk. Daniel spoke calmly. "Officer Mercer, our appearance before the court is scheduled within minutes. If we miss that hearing, you may want to notify the clerk immediately." Mercer responded without looking back. "You can explain your schedule later." Those words echoed more heavily than he realized. They were not disrespectful by volume, but by dismissal. Around them, courthouse employees watched through the glass entrance doors. Some recognized the names on the identification cards after overhearing fragments of conversation. Others noticed something different. Neither Isaiah nor Daniel ever referred to themselves by rank, experience, or military service. They simply answered questions directly and avoided escalating the encounter. Halfway to the patrol vehicle, another transmission finally reached the younger officer's radio with far less interference than before. He slowed his pace as the dispatcher spoke clearly. "The vehicle connected to the earlier report has now been located approximately 12 miles away. Repeat, the reporting party has confirmed a different license plate." The younger officer immediately looked toward Mercer. "Sir," he began carefully. Mercer raised one hand before the sentence could continue. "We are already committed to this investigation." The younger officer hesitated. Procedure encouraged communication, but chain of command demanded restraint. He reluctantly lowered the radio. Isaiah had heard enough to understand that something significant had changed. Even then, he offered no criticism. Instead, he quietly said, "Officer, I respectfully recommend confirming every update before today's hearing begins." Mercer answered with visible confidence, "I know exactly what I am doing." Several people nearby exchanged uncertain glances. The certainty in his voice no longer matched the uncertainty growing around the scene. Inside the courthouse, clerks continued preparing the morning docket. One empty chair at the counsel table drew repeated attention because two expected witnesses had still not arrived. The presiding judge, Rebecca Holloway, reviewed the schedule while asking her courtroom deputy whether there had been any communication regarding the delay. The answer was simple. None. Outside, the older courthouse employee who had placed the mysterious phone call watched from beneath the entrance canopy. He slipped his phone back into his jacket after receiving a brief response consisting of only 4 words. "Hold everything. We are coming." Those words unsettled him far more than they reassured him. He had worked at the courthouse for almost 3 decades and had learned that truly important people rarely announce themselves. They simply arrived. As Officer Mercer reached for the rear door of the patrol vehicle, the distant sound of approaching engines rolled through the downtown streets. It was not loud enough to draw immediate attention, but every veteran in uniform recognized one detail almost instantly. The vehicles moving toward the courthouse were traveling with disciplined precision, and none of them carried local police markings. The unmarked vehicles slowed as they approached the federal courthouse, stopping with the quiet precision of drivers who had rehearsed every movement long before that morning. They carried no flashing lights and no dramatic display, yet their arrival drew immediate attention from courthouse security officers who instinctively straightened their posture. Officer Ethan Mercer barely glanced in their direction. His focus remained fixed on Isaiah Brooks and Daniel Carter, convinced that finishing his investigation mattered more than whatever business had just arrived. The younger patrol officer, however, noticed something unusual. Every individual stepping from the vehicles wore conservative business attire or military uniforms without unnecessary ceremony. They moved with purpose instead of urgency, speaking into discreet earpieces while scanning the courthouse entrance rather than the crowd. None of them approached the patrol cars. Instead, one middle-aged man in a dark navy suit walked directly to the courthouse security supervisor and quietly displayed official credentials. The supervisor's expression changed almost instantly. He nodded once and disappeared inside the building without asking a single question. Isaiah watched the exchange from the corner of his eye, but remained silent. Daniel did the same. Years of military service had taught them that when experienced professionals suddenly became very quiet, something important was unfolding behind the scenes. Mercer interpreted their silence as resignation. "You both understand that cooperation will make this process easier," he said. Isaiah answered calmly. "We have cooperated from the beginning, officer." Mercer shook his head. "Then explain why sealed federal documents are sitting in your bag." Isaiah maintained steady eye contact. "Because the court ordered them to remain sealed until they are introduced through the proper legal process." The answer frustrated Mercer precisely because it sounded reasonable. Before he could respond, the younger officer stepped closer once more. "Sir, dispatch has now fully cleared the vehicle from the earlier report." Mercer looked at him without changing expression. "That does not end my investigation." The younger officer paused, clearly weighing whether to continue. Finally, he spoke carefully. "There is no active report connecting these gentlemen to the original incident." For the first time that morning, a brief silence settled over the sidewalk. Several bystanders exchanged confused looks. One reporter quietly lowered a microphone, sensing that the story might be changing directions. Mercer refused to acknowledge the shift. Instead, he requested identification checks through additional databases, determined to justify the stop through another avenue, if necessary. Isaiah simply nodded. "You are free to verify our identities." Daniel added, "Everything you need is already in the system." Their confidence puzzled everyone listening. Most people under public scrutiny tried to explain themselves. These two men seemed completely comfortable allowing official records to speak on their behalf. Inside the courthouse, Judge Rebecca Holloway was informed that two scheduled federal witnesses had still not appeared. Rather than delaying proceedings immediately, she instructed her courtroom deputy to determine whether law enforcement had been involved. Moments later, the deputy returned with only partial information. Two witnesses had reportedly been detained outside the courthouse, but no formal charges had yet been filed. The judge frowned. That sequence made little procedural sense. Outside, the suited official who had entered moments earlier emerged again, now accompanied by the United States Marshal assigned to courthouse security. They spoke quietly while both looked toward Isaiah and Daniel. Neither man approached immediately. Instead, the Marshal reached for his phone after receiving a brief message. He read it once, then looked up again with unmistakable surprise. "Are you certain?" he asked. The suited official answered with complete confidence. The confirmation came directly from Washington. At nearly the same moment, the courthouse clock struck the hour scheduled for the hearing to begin. Isaiah glanced toward the entrance, then back at Mercer. "Officer," he said with the same calm voice he had maintained all morning, "if we do not enter that courtroom within the next few minutes, someone much higher than either of us is going to start asking why." Mercer dismissed the warning as another attempt to pressure him, but less than 30 seconds later his own police radio came alive with a priority transmission. The dispatcher spoke only one sentence before the channel abruptly fell silent. "Officer Mercer, you are instructed to remain exactly where you are until a senior federal authority arrives on scene." Officer Ethan Mercer stared at the radio clipped to his shoulder for a brief moment, as though he expected the dispatcher to immediately correct what had just been said. The transmission had been clear. He was instructed to remain where he was until a senior federal authority arrived. Around him, the mood shifted almost imperceptibly. The confidence that had carried him through the encounter no longer spread naturally to the officers standing nearby. The younger patrol officer quietly lowered his notebook and avoided making assumptions. Experience had taught him that when multiple federal agencies suddenly became involved, the smartest decision was often to slow down rather than speed ahead. Isaiah Brooks and Daniel Carter remained exactly where they had been instructed to stand. Neither man displayed satisfaction nor frustration. Their composure reflected years of professional discipline rather than personal victory. Isaiah glanced toward the courthouse entrance, calculating the passing minutes with growing concern. Missing the hearing itself mattered less than delaying the legal process connected to the sealed documents. Daniel spoke softly enough that only Isaiah could hear. The timeline is slipping. Isaiah answered with a barely noticeable nod. I know. Across the street, reporters who had originally expected a routine courthouse morning now sensed something much larger developing. More cameras appeared. Television crews quietly positioned themselves without interfering with law enforcement. No one knew the complete story, but everyone recognized that ordinary traffic stops rarely attracted federal officials before formal paperwork had even been completed. Then another unexpected detail emerged. A black sport utility vehicle entered the secured courthouse driveway and stopped near the judge's entrance rather than the public entrance. Two individuals stepped out carrying locked document cases instead of briefcases. One of them immediately presented identification to a United States Marshal, who escorted both visitors inside without hesitation. The older courthouse employee who had placed the mysterious phone call earlier watched the exchange and quietly whispered to himself, "That confirms it." Nearby, a court clerk overheard him and asked, "Confirms what?" The employee simply shook his head. "Not here." The uncertainty spread faster than any rumor. Even Officer Mercer noticed that courthouse personnel who normally ignored activity outside were now watching every movement through the windows. His radio remained silent. Dispatch offered no additional explanation. Determined to regain control of the situation, Mercer requested another records inquiry. Within moments, the response arrived. Identification verified. No outstanding warrants. Federal employment history confirmed. Additional records are restricted from local access. Mercer frowned. Restricted records were uncommon. They existed, but most officers encountered them only a handful of times during their careers. Instead of treating the limitation as a reason for caution, he viewed it as another unanswered question. Restricted does not mean innocent, he said quietly. The younger officer respectfully replied, "No, sir. But it also does not mean guilty." The words lingered in the cool morning air. For the first time, Mercer offered no immediate response. Before anyone could continue the discussion, the main courthouse doors opened again. Judge Rebecca Holloway's courtroom deputy stepped outside, carrying an official court folder. He approached the United States Marshal first, exchanged several quiet sentences, then turned toward Mercer. "Officer," he said professionally, "the court has been informed that these two individuals were expected to appear as scheduled witnesses this morning. The judge is requesting a status update." Mercer answered confidently, "We are conducting a lawful investigation." The deputy nodded politely. "Understood." The judge has also been informed that representatives from the Department of the Navy and the Department of Justice are now en route. That single sentence caused several people nearby to stop moving altogether. The younger officer slowly looked toward Isaiah and Daniel, who remained completely expressionless. They neither confirmed nor denied the statement. They simply waited. Almost at the same moment, a secure phone inside the courthouse rang directly in Judge Holloway's chambers. She answered expecting routine administrative information. Instead, the voice on the other end identified itself as calling from the office of the Chief of Naval Operations and asked one unexpected question that immediately changed the way she viewed the entire morning. "Your Honor, have the two witnesses remained safe while awaiting our arrival?" Judge Rebecca Holloway remained silent for several seconds after the secure call ended. During her 23 years on the federal bench, she had learned that truly sensitive cases rarely announced themselves with dramatic speeches. Instead, they revealed their importance through quiet conversations, restricted files, and officials who chose every word with extraordinary care. The question she had just been asked echoed in her mind. It had not been whether the scheduled witnesses would arrive on time. It had not been whether the hearing could be delayed. It had been whether they had remained safe. There was a significant difference, and she recognized it immediately. She instructed her courtroom deputy to suspend the morning docket for a short recess and requested an updated report from the United States Marshal before any further proceedings continued. Outside, Officer Ethan Mercer stood beside his patrol vehicle while the growing crowd watched events unfold with increasing curiosity. His confidence had begun to shift into frustration. Every new piece of information seemed to raise more questions instead of confirming his original assumptions. Isaiah Brooks and Daniel Carter still waited patiently, never once asking for special treatment. Their discipline remained remarkably consistent. They answered questions when asked, followed lawful instructions, and allowed the process to unfold without confrontation. To several experienced courthouse employees, that level of self-control spoke louder than any explanation could have. The younger patrol officer quietly approached Mercer once again. "Sir," he said carefully, "we now have confirmation that their identities are legitimate. The vehicle is cleared, and federal agencies are requesting immediate coordination. We may want to reconsider how we proceed." Mercer looked toward Isaiah before answering. "Until someone with proper authority tells me otherwise, this investigation continues." The younger officer nodded respectfully, although uncertainty remained visible on his face. At that exact moment, another secure communication reached the United States Marshal. He listened without interrupting, then looked toward the courthouse entrance with unmistakable urgency. Without raising his voice, he instructed security personnel to clear a direct path from the front entrance to courtroom 3. The request immediately caught the attention of everyone nearby. Reporters noticed the unusual security adjustment. Lawyers waiting outside quietly stepped aside without being asked twice. Even courthouse staff exchanged puzzled glances because that protocol was normally reserved for exceptionally senior government officials. Halfway through the preparations, one of the suited federal representatives opened a locked document case and carefully removed a sealed envelope bearing the official seal of the United States Department of the Navy. He handed it directly to the marshal with instructions that it be delivered unopened to Judge Holloway. The marshal accepted it with both hands, acknowledging the transfer with formal precision before disappearing inside the courthouse. Isaiah watched the envelope disappear through the entrance doors, but gave no visible reaction. Daniel quietly exhaled, almost as though a critical piece of a carefully constructed timeline had finally fallen into place. "They made it," he said softly. Isaiah answered without taking his eyes off the courthouse. "Right on schedule." Mercer overheard the exchange, but misunderstood its meaning. He assumed they were referring to legal representation rather than something much larger. Before he could ask another question, several uniformed Navy personnel appeared at the far end of the courthouse corridor, walking with measured confidence rather than haste. They did not approach Isaiah or Daniel directly. Instead, they reported first to the United States Marshal, demonstrating clear respect for the authority of the federal court. That small detail impressed Judge Holloway when she was informed moments later. Every agency involved appeared committed to proper legal procedure instead of influence or spectacle. Then another message reached the courtroom deputy. He entered the judge's chambers, leaned forward, and quietly delivered a single update. Judge Holloway looked toward the sealed Navy envelope resting on her desk before asking one simple question. "Has the principal arrived?" The deputy answered with a respectful nod. "Yes, Your Honor. He has just entered the building." Almost simultaneously, outside the courthouse, every Navy service member standing near the entrance instinctively adjusted their posture. Their eyes shifted toward the front doors, and without a single command being spoken aloud, the entire atmosphere changed as though everyone present suddenly understood that the next person to walk into the courthouse carried an authority that could instantly redefine everything Officer Mercer believed he knew. At Judge Holloway's direction, Isaiah and Daniel were escorted into courtroom 3 so the court could determine why 2 federally ordered witnesses had arrived in handcuffs. Mercer entered behind them, still prepared to defend the arrest. The judge had barely begun questioning him when the rear courtroom doors opened. Every Navy officer in the gallery rose at once. Admiral Nathaniel Grant walked into the courtroom in full-dress uniform. As commander of the Naval Special Warfare Group to which both men were assigned, Grant had personally authorized their appearance under the Federal Protective Order. He looked directly at the 2 handcuffed SEALs and asked, "Why are 2 members of my command standing before this court in restraints?" Mercer froze. Grant stepped toward Isaiah and Daniel, his attention fixed on the 2 handcuffed sailors rather than the officer standing nearby. "Are either of you injured?" Isaiah answered first. "No, Admiral." Daniel followed. "No, sir." Grant looked carefully at both men for a moment longer, almost as though confirming their condition personally before turning his attention elsewhere. That brief exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet everyone watching understood they were witnessing a relationship built through duty rather than familiarity. After a brief respectful exchange with Isaiah and Daniel, Grant turned toward Officer Mercer. Mercer met the Admiral's gaze and remained professional. "Sir, I am conducting an active investigation." His expression remained completely composed, revealing neither anger nor approval. "Officer," he replied in the same calm, measured voice that had commanded sailors for decades. "I appreciate your willingness to perform your responsibilities. I would now appreciate understanding the legal basis for delaying two federally scheduled witnesses whose identities have already been confirmed." The question was asked politely, but its precision immediately shifted the balance of the conversation. Mercer explained the original vehicle report, his observations, and the presence of sealed documents. Grant listened without interrupting once. When Mercer finished, the Admiral asked another quiet question. "Were you informed that the vehicle associated with the original report had already been located elsewhere?" Mercer hesitated for the first time that morning. "I received additional information, yes." "And after receiving that information, what independent facts continued to support delaying these witnesses?" Silence followed. It was not an uncomfortable silence created by hostility. It was the silence that appears when a carefully constructed explanation suddenly loses its strongest foundation. Several reporters standing nearby instinctively lowered their voices, sensing that every word now mattered. Judge Holloway's courtroom deputy emerged from the courthouse carrying the sealed envelope that had remained unopened until that moment. Approaching Admiral Grant, he respectfully informed him that the judge was prepared to resume proceedings immediately and had requested his presence in courtroom 3. Grant accepted the message with a courteous nod before looking once more toward Isaiah and Daniel. "Gentlemen," he said, "the court is waiting." As the group began walking toward the courthouse entrance together, Officer Mercer noticed something that sent an unexpected chill through his confidence. The courtroom deputy had addressed Admiral Grant by a title even more formal than he had anticipated, and attached to the Admiral's visitor credentials was an authorization designation that Mercer had only seen once before during advanced law enforcement training, a designation reserved for officials with direct authority over matters involving national security. The doors to courtroom 3 closed with a quiet click that seemed to separate the noise of speculation outside from the discipline of the legal process inside. Judge Rebecca Holloway resumed her seat and looked across the courtroom with renewed attention. What had begun as an ordinary morning had transformed into a proceeding involving federal agencies, military leadership, and questions that reached far beyond a routine police investigation. She waited until everyone was seated before speaking. "This court is prepared to establish the facts," she said evenly. "Nothing more and nothing less." Isaiah Brooks and Daniel Carter took their places without drawing attention to themselves. They did not look toward the gallery or the reporters filling every available seat. Their focus remained on the judge. Admiral Nathaniel Grant sat several rows behind them, accompanied by legal representatives from the Department of the Navy and the Department of Justice. His presence required no announcement. Everyone in the room already understood who he was. Officer Ethan Mercer remained composed, although the certainty he had carried throughout the morning had noticeably faded. He had expected a straightforward explanation. Instead, every answer had revealed a larger picture. Judge Holloway nodded toward the Navy attorney. "Counsel, you may proceed." The attorney stood and placed a sealed folder on the evidence table. "Your Honor, this material has now been cleared for limited disclosure under the court's protective order." The courtroom grew completely silent. Even the reporters stopped typing. The attorney carefully opened the folder and removed several official documents bearing federal seals. Chief Petty Officer Isaiah Brooks and Senior Chief Daniel Carter were not appearing before this court as criminal defendants, suspects, or ordinary witnesses. Both men are active members of the United States Navy SEALs, assigned through naval special warfare to duties whose operational details remain classified. They were appearing under lawful federal orders connected to an ongoing Department of Defense matter requiring judicial oversight. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery before immediately fading again. The attorney continued. "Certain operational details remain classified and will remain protected. However, this court may be informed that their timely appearance was required to authenticate evidence already submitted under seal in a federal proceeding." Judge Holloway reviewed the documents one page at a time before looking back toward the attorney. "Has the authenticity of these records been independently verified?" "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied. by both the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice. That single answer altered the atmosphere inside the courtroom. The issue was no longer whether Isaiah and Daniel had legitimate reasons for protecting the contents of the sealed folder. The issue had become whether their unnecessary delay had interfered with an official federal proceeding. Officer Mercer listened carefully as the attorney explained that neither man had refused lawful identification, attempted to leave, or obstructed officers in any way. Instead, both had consistently requested that proper verification procedures be followed before sensitive federal material changed hands. Halfway through the presentation, Judge Holloway turned toward Mercer. "Officer, the record reflects that dispatch later confirmed the original vehicle report did not involve these individuals. Is that accurate?" Mercer answered honestly. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded once. "Thank you for your candor." There was no accusation in her voice, only careful attention to the facts. Admiral Grant remained silent throughout the exchange, allowing the legal process to unfold without interruption. His restraint carried its own message. He had not come to influence the court. He had come to ensure that official records spoke for themselves. As the hearing continued, the Navy attorney introduced one final document for the judge's review. Unlike the others, this one carried an additional authorization signed at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Judge Holloway examined the signature carefully, then paused longer than before. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. She looked first toward Isaiah and Daniel, then toward Admiral Grant. This court now understands why their presence was considered indispensable. Before anyone could respond, the courtroom clerk quietly approached the bench with another sealed communication that had just arrived moments earlier. Judge Holloway read the first line, looked up with unmistakable surprise, and announced that an additional federal official had requested permission to address the court regarding the consequences of the morning's delay. Judge Rebecca Holloway placed the newly delivered communication beside the other sealed documents and allowed the courtroom to settle into complete silence before speaking. "The court has reviewed the additional certification submitted by the Department of Justice," she said. "It confirms that Chief Petty Officer Isaiah Brooks and Senior Chief Daniel Carter were lawfully directed to appear before this court in connection with a protected federal matter. The court further finds no evidence that either individual refused lawful identification or acted in a manner inconsistent with their legal obligations." Once dispatch confirmed that the reported vehicle had been located elsewhere and that its license plate did not match, the record shows no remaining specific and articulable facts supporting continued detention, much less a custodial arrest. The arrest of both witnesses therefore lacked an adequate factual basis. Every word carried the steady weight of procedure rather than emotion. The courtroom listened without interruption. The reporters who had spent the morning searching for dramatic headlines now found themselves documenting something far more meaningful, the careful restoration of facts. Judge Holloway continued, "This court also recognizes that the initial vehicle information was corrected during the encounter and that the identities of both witnesses were subsequently verified. Future administrative review regarding the detention and its consequences falls within the authority of the appropriate agencies." She deliberately avoided assigning conclusions beyond the evidence before her, allowing the legal process to remain exactly where it belonged. A later professional standards review compared Mercer's courthouse stops over the previous year. Investigators found that he had repeatedly allowed white professionals to verify credentials before escalating, while black men were more frequently detained based on incomplete descriptions. The department concluded that implicit racial bias had influenced his decision to arrest Isaiah and Daniel. Officer Ethan Mercer stood quietly as those words settled over the courtroom. The certainty that had defined his actions that morning had disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable realization that confidence without complete information could carry serious consequences. He looked briefly toward Isaiah and Daniel before lowering his eyes. There was no applause, no celebration, and no public humiliation. Only the unmistakable gravity of accountability. Before Mercer left the courthouse, his supervisor informed him that he was being relieved of field duties pending a joint administrative review. His body camera footage, dispatch records, and decision to continue the arrest after the vehicle had been cleared were formally preserved. Investigators would determine whether policy violations, interference with a federal proceeding, or evidence of racial bias had contributed to his decision-making. Admiral Nathaniel Grant finally rose from his seat. The courtroom instinctively became even quieter. He did not criticize anyone. He did not demand punishment. Instead, he addressed Judge Holloway with measured respect. "Your Honor, on behalf of the United States Navy, I appreciate the court's commitment to allowing verified facts to guide today's proceedings. The integrity of both our military and our justice system depends upon that principle." Judge Holloway acknowledged his remarks with a respectful nod. "This court shares that belief, Admiral." Grant then turned toward Isaiah Brooks and Daniel Carter. "Gentlemen, your responsibility to this court has now been fulfilled. Your professionalism throughout today's events reflects honor upon your service." Both men acknowledged the statement with quiet respect. Neither sought recognition. Neither displayed resentment. They simply accepted the outcome with the same discipline they had demonstrated since the first moment Officer Mercer approached them outside the courthouse. As the hearing formally concluded, representatives from the Department of Justice and the Department of the Navy exchanged official documents with the clerk, ensuring every procedural requirement had been satisfied before leaving the courtroom. Reporters waited outside hoping for dramatic statements, but none came. Isaiah politely declined interviews. Daniel offered only a brief smile before following the Admiral through the courthouse corridor. Their silence spoke more powerfully than any prepared speech could have. Officer Mercer remained inside for several moments after the courtroom had nearly emptied. The younger patrol officer approached him quietly. Neither man spoke at first. Finally, Mercer broke the silence. "I should have waited for the complete information." The younger officer answered without judgment. "We all make decisions. The important part is what we learn after them." Mercer gave a slow nod, understanding that experience alone never guaranteed wisdom. Outside, the afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds that had covered Norfolk since morning. Isaiah and Daniel walked toward the waiting government vehicles beside Admiral Grant, their steps as steady as they had been hours earlier. Nothing about their posture suggested triumph over another person. Instead, it reflected quiet confidence in a system that, despite its imperfections, still possessed the ability to correct itself when truth was allowed to speak. As the vehicles departed, the courthouse gradually returned to its ordinary rhythm. Lawyers hurried to afternoon hearings. Families entered through the front doors. Reporters filed their stories. Yet for everyone who had witnessed the events of that day, one lesson remained impossible to forget. A uniform may represent authority, but authority reaches its highest purpose only when it is guided by fairness, patience, and respect for the facts. Badges, ranks, and titles all carry responsibility, but character is revealed in the moments before certainty becomes judgment. And sometimes the strongest measure of justice is not the power to accuse, but the humility to let the truth arrive before reaching a conclusion.